Kansas, 1889. Caleb Mercer rode into Red Creek with the sun going down behind him and nothing ahead of him but a name someone had scratched on a piece of paper. He was 31 years old, and in 13 of those years he had learned exactly one thing about himself: he was the kind of man people wanted only until the work was finished. His horse was tired. His boots were gray with 3 counties of dust. His coat had a tear at the shoulder he had never bothered to mend because there had never seemed to be a reason to keep anything looking new. He carried a thin bedroll, a battered saddlebag, and a folded scrap of paper with 2 words written on it in another man's handwriting: Whitaker Ranch. He had heard about the place from a stable hand in Ellsworth who said a widow out past Red Creek was looking for someone steady. Caleb had ridden 4 days on those 6 words. 4 days was nothing new. He had ridden further on less. The town itself was small and plain, a handful of buildings leaning into each other along a dirt street, but the land past it opened up into the kind of grass that made a working man's chest go quiet. Caleb followed the wagon road west, past a burned-out cattle pen nobody had rebuilt, past a stand of cottonwoods bending in the evening wind, until he came to a weathered white house sitting on a low rise above a stretch of open prairie. The paint on the boards had peeled in long strips, showing gray wood underneath, but somebody had kept the porch swept and the steps solid. A wooden gate. A wash line. A garden that had been watered even through what looked like a hard, dry summer. This was not a ranch that had been abandoned. This was a ranch somebody was refusing to let go. Caleb tied his horse at the fence. He took his hat off before he reached the door, the same as his mother had taught him 30 years earlier in a house he no longer remembered clearly. Some habits stayed with a man long after the people who taught them were gone. He knocked. The door opened, and Caleb forgot, for a moment, the speech he had been practicing since sunup. She was younger than he expected. 27 or 28, fair-haired, with 2 braids wound back from her face and a pair of gray eyes that studied him the way a rancher studies weather, reading him for what he might bring, good or bad. She wore a plain blue dress with a small, faded pattern, sleeves rolled to the wrist, and she held a worn Bible against her chest with both arms, the way a person holds something they are not ready to put down. She looked at him for several long seconds. Not with fear. With something closer to disbelief. "Ma'am," Caleb said, turning his hat in his hands, "I heard you might be needing a ranch hand. I'm good with horses and cattle, and I don't ask for more than a fair day's wage for a fair day's work." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved over him, his dusty boots, the worn leather of his saddlebag strap, his hands, his tired face, the way a person reads a letter twice to be sure they understood it the first time. Then she said it, quiet enough that Caleb had to lean in slightly to be sure he'd heard her right. "I was praying you'd come." Caleb almost laughed. He assumed she meant it the ordinary way people meant things like that she'd been hoping for a decent hand to show up before the season got any harder. He opened his mouth to say something polite about being glad to be of use. She spoke again before he could. "Not a ranch hand, Mr. Mercer." Her grip on the Bible tightened. "A man I could trust." He didn't know how she had his name already, and he didn't ask. Something about the way she said trust made the word land heavier than it should have for a man she'd known for 11 seconds. Caleb Mercer had been many things in his life. Hired hand. Fence rider. Horse breaker. A man other people needed exactly as long as there was work left to do. Nobody had ever opened a door and looked at him like he was an answer to something. He didn't know what to do with it, so for a moment he simply stood on the porch, hat in his hands, waiting for the ground to explain itself. 3 questions rose up in him at once, and he suspected they would follow him the rest of the evening. Why had a widow been praying for a stranger to show up on her porch? What had happened to the man who used to run this ranch before her? And why, when he glanced past her shoulder toward the horizon, did he see a rider sitting still on a distant rise, watching the house like he had nowhere better to be? "Come inside," the woman said. I'll explain myself before you decide whether you still want the job. Caleb followed her in, because there wasn't a version of that moment where a tired, broke, and curious man does anything else. Her name was Nora Whitaker. Her husband, Everett, had been dead 14 months, thrown from a spooked horse while repairing fence in a spring storm, gone before anybody could fetch help from town. He had left her 240 acres of good grassland, the strongest spring water within 10 miles, 60 head of cattle thinned down by a brutal dry season, and a debt to the Red Creek Bank that was coming due faster than the herd could recover. She laid it all out at the kitchen table. The Bible closed now, set beside a ledger open to a page of careful, patient handwriting that Caleb understood immediately hadn't been written by a careless woman. Everett's numbers, and beneath them, Nora's own, keeping the account current in a hand steadier than most men Caleb had worked for. "The bank won't extend the note," she said. "Mr. Briggs was gentle about it, but he told me plain enough that a widow alone is a risk they don't care to carry. And there's a rancher to the east, Silas Rourke, who's offered to buy this place twice. Both times I told him no. Both times he smiled like a man who only has to wait long enough." Caleb turned his hat over once in his hands. "And you think hiring me changes any of that?" "I think," Nora said, "that I've been trying to run a working cattle ranch by myself for over a year, and I am tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. I don't need rescuing, Mr. Mercer. I've been doing my own rescuing since the day they buried my husband. What I need is someone who won't disappear the first time things get difficult." That sentence found the one soft place in Caleb Mercer that 13 years of ranch work had never managed to callous over. He told her he'd stay through the season. Nothing more promised, nothing more asked. She told him the bunkhouse hadn't been used since her foreman left, but it was dry and the roof didn't leak, which in a Kansas summer was its own kind of luxury. Caleb Mercer had ridden into Red Creek looking for a paycheck. He didn't yet understand that he had ridden into something considerably larger than that. That first night, lying on a narrow cot in the bunkhouse with the window open to the sound of crickets and a herd settling somewhere out in the dark, Caleb found himself turning the widow's words over the way a man turns a coin he isn't sure is real. A man I could trust. Nobody had ever described him with that word before. Reliable, maybe. Useful, certainly. Trust was a different animal. Trust meant somebody expected to still be standing beside you after the job was finished, and Caleb had never once tested whether he was built for that kind of arrangement. He decided, somewhere before sleep took him, that he would find out. The first weeks fell into a rhythm that suited them both. Caleb repaired fence line that had been sagging since before Everett died. He walked the herd twice a day, learning which cows favored the low pasture and which bull had a temper worth respecting. He found the spring that fed the western end of the property and understood immediately, the way any working cowboy would, exactly why a neighboring rancher might want it badly enough to keep offering to buy land he didn't need. Nora was not the fragile widow the town gossip had painted her as. She could rope, she could mend harness, and she kept books better than most bank clerks Caleb had met. What she couldn't do, what nobody could do entirely alone, was run 240 acres, 60 head of cattle, and a household with only 2 hands and no rest. One evening, after Caleb had fallen asleep sitting against the barn wall with a coil of fence wire still in his lap, Nora woke him with a tin cup of coffee. "You'll break your neck sleeping like that," she said. Caleb took the cup and drank, then made a face. "This the first coffee you've made, or the first one that survived being boiled with a horseshoe still in the pot?" Nora laughed, really laughed, not the polite kind she gave to town folks who asked after her welfare. It was the first time Caleb had heard the sound, and he found himself wanting to hear it again before he'd finished admitting that to himself. There was a young hand named Eli Turner who worked the eastern pasture 2 days a week for a neighboring outfit and had taken to finding reasons to ride over and help at the Whitaker place more often than his own employer probably knew about. Eli was 19, all elbows and opinions, and he had decided within his first afternoon of watching Caleb work that the older cowboy was the most interesting thing to happen to Red Creek in years. "You gonna teach me that thing you do with the nervous ones?" Eli asked one morning, watching Caleb calm a nervous gray gelding that had thrown 2 riders before him, "or is that a secret you're taking to your grave?" "It's not a secret," Caleb said. "It's patience. Something you're welcome to try sometime." "I got patience." "You got about 4 minutes of it, and then you start talking." Eli grinned like he'd been paid a compliment, and Caleb found himself, against every instinct he had cultivated over 13 solitary years, starting to enjoy having the boy underfoot. A week later, Nora asked Caleb to teach her the same trick with a young mare that had come to the ranch spooked and thin-ribbed from a previous owner's rough handling. Caleb stood behind her in the corral, his hands over hers on the lead rope, showing her how to let the animal's fear run its course instead of fighting it. "You're not trying to make her trust you," he said quietly, near her ear. "You're just trying to give her a reason not to run." Nora went still for a moment, and Caleb realized, a beat too late, that he had just described exactly what was happening between the two of them, and neither one of them was talking about the horse anymore. Neither of them said so out loud. The mare settled beneath their hands, and so, for a moment, did everything else. It didn't take long for Red Creek to notice. Clara Dawson, who ran the general store and considered gossip a form of public service, was the first to remark that the widow Whitaker had brought a strange, handsome cowboy out to her ranch, and wasn't that curious, and didn't it make a person wonder? Within 2 weeks, half the town had an opinion. Some said Nora had finally found herself a husband. Others said the cowboy was only after the ranch, and a widow desperate enough to hire a stranger off the road was a widow desperate enough to be fooled by one. Caleb hated the talk. Nora seemed to expect it. "People talk when they don't know the truth," she told him one afternoon, mending a bridle on the porch steps while he checked a colt's shoe. "Then they must be very busy people," Caleb said, "to have opinions about a ranch they've never set foot on." Nora smiled without looking up. It was the kind of exchange that made the long days easier, and Caleb noticed, though he did not yet say so out loud, that Silas Rourke had begun riding past the property line more often than any legitimate business could explain. Silas Rourke was not a loud man, and that was precisely what made him dangerous. He dressed better than any rancher had cause to on a working spread, dark wool coat, boots polished even after a day in the saddle, a hat that had never once been rained on and lived to show it. He owned 3 times the land Nora did and had never needed a single acre of hers for grazing. What he wanted was the water, and he had wanted it since before Everett Whitaker's boots were even cold. He rode up to the Whitaker fence line one afternoon while Caleb was mending a gate hinge, and sat his horse there a long moment before speaking, the way a man does when he already knows the conversation is going to go his way eventually, and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "Mercer," Silas said, tipping his hat with a courtesy that felt like an insult. "Heard you're settling in nicely. Heard you've got your own fence line to ride, Mr. Rourke." Silas smiled, unbothered. "A man in my position likes to know his neighbors. Especially new ones who show up out of nowhere and start making themselves comfortable in another man's house." "It's Mrs. Whitaker's house," Caleb said. "Has been the whole time." "For now," Silas said, and turned his horse without waiting for a reply, leaving Caleb standing at the fence with a wrench in his hand and a feeling in his gut that the man's smile had told him more than his words ever would. The ledger changed everything. Caleb found it while repairing a warped floorboard in the ranch office, tucked beneath a loose panel Everett must have built himself. Inside were pages of careful notes in a dead man's hand, sketches of the property boundary, measurements, and a single line, underlined twice, that read, "Survey may be wrong, spring on our side." Caleb brought it straight to Nora. She went pale reading it. If Everett was right, that spring has been ours the whole time, and Silas has spent 3 years trying to buy land he already knows might not be his to take. And if he was wrong? Then I've been sitting on a fantasy my husband never got the chance to prove, and challenging Silas over it could cost us everything we still have." Caleb set his hand flat on the table, steady. "We don't accuse anybody yet. We find the original county survey and we let the paper speak for itself." It was, in its own quiet way, the moment Nora Whitaker started trusting Caleb Mercer with more than her cattle. They wrote to the county clerk's office. They asked around Red Creek, carefully, about who might remember the original boundary markers being set. Grant Holloway, Nora's old foreman, who had left the ranch under circumstances nobody in town fully explained, became, unexpectedly, the person with the clearest memory of where those markers had once stood. Caleb had suspected Grant for a while. A man who knew the ranch that well, who'd left right around the time the finances turned bad, was an easy man to suspect. It was Grant himself who finally set the record straight, standing in the yard with his hat pushed back and an old grievance finally spoken out loud. "Silas offered me money," Grant said, "to tell him where Everett kept his land records. I told him to go to hell and I quit before I did something I couldn't take back. I never told your husband why I left, Nora. Guess I should've." It turned a man the story had asked the audience to suspect into the one ally who had been telling the truth the whole time. Ruth Harlan, who had known Nora since before her wedding to Everett and considered herself entitled to an opinion on every decision Nora made since, rode over the following afternoon with a basket of preserves and an expression that made clear the preserves were only half the reason for the visit. "You look happier than I've seen you look in over a year," Ruth said, watching Nora and Caleb work opposite ends of the same fence line without needing to speak to stay in rhythm with each other. "We're mending fence, Ruth." Ruth set the basket down on the porch rail. "I've mended plenty of fence in my life, dear. I've never once seen anybody smile at a fence post the way you just smiled at that man." Nora didn't have an answer for that, which Ruth seemed to take as answer enough. She left without pressing further, but not before pulling Nora aside at the gate and saying, in a voice that had lost all its teasing, "Everett would want you happy. Don't let this town, or that man across the fence line, talk you out of something good because you're afraid of what people will say." The break-in happened on a Tuesday night in late July, while Caleb was out checking a fence line half a mile from the house. He came back to find the office door forced open, papers scattered across the floor, and Everett's ledger gone. Nora stood in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself, more furious than frightened. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for. "Which means," Caleb said, "somebody's been watching this ranch a lot closer than we thought." Silas Rourke chose that same week to spread the rumor that finally pushed the town's gossip past whispering and into something meaner, that Caleb Mercer hadn't been hired for his hands at all, that Nora intended to marry him purely to keep her land out of the bank's reach, and that any man willing to marry a widow for her acreage wasn't worth the boots he stood in. Caleb offered to leave. He told Nora, plainly, that he'd rather ride out than watch her reputation get dragged through Red Creek because of him. Nora wouldn't hear it. "If I wanted a man who ran the first time people started talking," she said, "I wouldn't have prayed for one who rode 4 days through the dust to get here." Caleb didn't have an answer for that. He didn't try to find one. He simply stayed. That night, once the house had gone quiet and the last lamp had been turned low, Caleb found Nora sitting on the porch steps, still awake, staring out at a herd she couldn't see in the dark but clearly needed to know was there. He sat down beside her without asking. For a while neither of them said anything at all. "I'm not afraid of Silas," Nora said finally. "I'm afraid of what happens to this town's opinion of me if he wins. I've spent 14 months trying to prove I could hold on to what Everett left me without needing a man to do it for me. If people decide I only kept this ranch because I married my way to keeping it, they'll have taken that away from me too. Nobody who's watched you run this place could believe that," Caleb said. "People believe whatever's easiest to believe, Caleb. That's the whole trouble with people." He reached over, slow enough that she could have pulled away if she'd wanted to, and took her hand. She didn't pull away. Then we'll just have to give them something harder to believe instead, he said. The truth. Nora looked at him a long moment in the dark, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she leaned her head against his shoulder and let herself rest there, just for a minute, before the work of the next day came looking for her again. Deputy Thomas Bell rode out a few days later, having heard enough about the break-in and the missing records to take official notice. He was a calm, unhurried man who didn't seem inclined to take sides until he had facts in hand, which Caleb respected more than he expected to. "Rourke's been pressuring folks around here longer than you've been in town," Bell told Caleb privately, checking the busted office lock. "Never proven anything on him yet. Man's careful. But careful men still leave tracks if you look close enough." Caleb and Grant spent the following days doing exactly that, comparing notes, retracing who had access to the office, narrowing down who in Red Creek might have been paid to do Silas's dirty work rather than his own. They didn't have proof. Not yet. What they had was a growing certainty, and a county clerk's office 2 days ride away that might hold the original survey Everett had died still trying to find. Before Caleb could make that ride, the sky over the western pasture turned the wrong color. The fire started in the dry grass past the far fence line, on the hottest, driest afternoon Kansas had handed them all summer. By the time Caleb spotted the smoke, it was already running with the wind, faster than any man on foot could outpace it. "Get the cattle toward the creek," Caleb shouted, already moving. "Now, Nora, now." She didn't argue about her own safety. She took the plow horse and rode straight for the western fence line instead of away from it, because leaving the herd penned in the fire's path had never once crossed her mind as an option. "Those cattle aren't leaving without me," she called back, and Caleb understood, watching her disappear into the smoke, that whatever he'd been telling himself about staying only through the season was no longer true. He had fallen in love with a woman who would rather burn than abandon what was hers, and there was no future version of himself that rode away from that. They fought the fire with everything the ranch had prepared them for, the cleared strip Caleb had cut around the barn weeks earlier now serving as a firebreak, wet sacks beaten against creeping flame, horses driven clear of the smoke before panic could take them. The heat pressed against Caleb's skin like a hand shoving him backward, and still he kept moving, because stopping meant losing the barn, and losing the barn meant losing everything Nora had spent 14 months refusing to let go of. Eli arrived on a lathered horse not 10 minutes into it, having seen the smoke from 3 miles off and ridden straight for the Whitaker place without anyone sending word. Caleb put him on the eastern line without a second thought, trusting the boy with a section of fence and a herd of frightened cattle he wouldn't have trusted him with a month earlier. Eli held that line like his life depended on it, because in a very real sense, that summer, it did. Grant showed up not long after, having ridden past the ridge and seen the smoke rolling up black against the last of the daylight. He worked the water line without being asked, hauling buckets from the creek until his arms shook, muttering the whole time about Silas Rourke in language Caleb privately agreed with completely. The smoke burned Caleb's lungs raw. Ash settled into the creases of his hands, into his collar, into the corners of his eyes until the whole world narrowed down to heat and noise and the next task directly in front of him. Somewhere in the chaos he lost track of how much time had passed, only that his shoulders ached and his throat felt scraped hollow and the fire kept coming anyway, indifferent to how tired everyone fighting it had become. Through the haze, on the ridge above the burning pasture, Caleb saw a rider sit motionless, watching. Silas. For one long breath, Caleb wanted nothing more than to ride straight up that hill and drag the truth out of the man with his own 2 hands. Then Nora's voice cut through the smoke, screaming that the cattle were breaking through the eastern fence, and Caleb turned his horse away from the ridge and rode for her instead. He chose Nora and the herd over revenge, and something in him settled the moment he made the choice, the way a man settles once he finally stops arguing with what he already knows about himself. The wind shifted an hour before dark. The fire lost its strength near the creek, smothered by wet ground and sheer exhaustion, and by the time the first thin rain began to fall, the ranch house still stood, blackened at the edges but standing, and the herd, bruised, smoke-stained, but alive, had made it to water. Caleb had a burn along his forearm and a gash above his eyebrow he didn't remember earning. He sat against the fence post afterward, too spent to do anything but breathe. Nora found him there. She knelt beside him without a word, checked the burn with careful hands, and said nothing until she was certain he wasn't hurt worse than he looked. "I came here looking for a job," Caleb said finally, watching the last of the smoke drift toward a clearing sky. "And what did you find?" Nora asked. He looked at her, soot on her cheek, hair loose from its braid, gray eyes steady even after everything the day had thrown at her, and answered without hesitating. "A reason to stay." Nora didn't say anything to that right away. She simply leaned down and kissed him, gentle at first and then not so gentle, both of them still smelling of smoke and creek water, both of them too exhausted and too relieved to pretend any longer that what had grown between them over the summer was only friendship. When she finally pulled back, her forehead resting against his, she laughed softly, the sound rough with smoke and something that might have been disbelief at her own boldness. "I have wanted to do that," she admitted, "since roughly the second week you were here." "Could have said something," Caleb murmured. "Would have saved us both a lot of pretending. And miss watching you try not to stare at me over the fence line for 2 months. Not a chance, Mr. Mercer." Eli, passing by with a bucket in each hand, let out a whoop loud enough to startle a nearby horse, and Grant told him to get back to work before Caleb decided he needed a lesson in minding his own business. Nobody moved particularly fast to separate. For the first time all summer, there was something worth smiling about in the middle of the wreckage. The days after the fire moved slower, the way any ranch does once the worst of a crisis has passed and the ordinary work of rebuilding takes over. Caleb's arm healed under a bandage Nora changed every morning. The bank problem hadn't vanished, Walter Briggs still expected his payment, but the evidence they'd gathered, paired with what the county clerk finally confirmed once Caleb made the 2-day ride out to retrieve the original survey, told a story Silas Rourke couldn't talk his way around. The old boundary marker had been moved. Not by nature, not by time, but by a hired surveyor 30 years earlier who'd been paid to shift a line half a mile in the wrong direction, long before Everett or Nora had ever set foot on the property. The spring had always belonged to the Whitaker land. Deputy Bell took the survey, the recovered ledger, found, eventually, buried under loose hay in Silas's own barn by a stable boy who'd grown tired of keeping a secret that wasn't his to keep. And enough testimony from Grant and half the town's quieter residents to end whatever leverage Silas Rourke had spent years building. Silas didn't go to prison. Land disputes rarely end that dramatically in a place like Red Creek. But he lost the water source he'd wanted for 3 years, he lost the respect of a town that had started looking at him differently once the truth came out, and he never rode past the Whitaker fence line again. Deputy Bell rode out one last time to deliver the news himself, sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee Nora insisted on making him, despite Caleb's teasing that the man deserved fair warning about her coffee first. "Rourke's lawyer's already trying to make the whole thing sound like an honest mistake 30 years old, Bell said. "Might be he even believes it himself by now. Doesn't much matter. Survey's clear, the ledger's recovered, and half the county watched Grant Holloway stand up in front of the bank and say exactly what Silas offered him to keep quiet. That kind of story doesn't stay quiet long in a town this size. Feels strange, Nora admitted, to have it just be over. Most trouble ends quieter than it starts, Bell said, standing to leave. You two did the hard part. Let the rest of it be boring for a while. Boring's a gift, Mrs. Whitaker. Don't waste it." Clara Dawson, to her credit, was the first person in town to apologize to Nora directly, admitting that she'd repeated gossip she should have questioned harder before letting it spread. Nora accepted the apology the way she accepted most things, plainly, without holding on to it longer than it deserved. "I'll tell you the same thing I told everybody else who asked," Clara added, a little sheepish. "I said the ranch hand you'd taken in was awfully handsome, and I stand by that much, at least." Nora laughed despite herself, and Caleb, overhearing from across the yard, decided that was one piece of gossip he wasn't in any hurry to correct. The debt manageable, the ranch stabilizing, and the mystery finally settled, Caleb found himself standing at a crossroads he hadn't expected to reach so soon. He had money saved. He had no more practical reason to stay. He told Nora, one evening on the porch, that he understood if she needed him to move on now that the trouble had passed. He didn't want her to feel obligated by everything they'd survived together. Nora didn't argue, and didn't ask him to stay, which surprised him more than if she had. "You came here looking for work," she said. "You don't owe me your life because I hired you." It was the first time in Caleb Mercer's adult life that someone had handed him the freedom to leave without a single string attached, and it was precisely that freedom that made him certain, for the first time, that leaving was the last thing he wanted. "I know I don't owe you anything," he said. "I'm not staying because I owe you. I'm staying because for the first time since I left home at 17, somebody wants me around even when there's no work left that needs doing." Nora's eyes went bright, though she didn't cry. "I wasn't praying for a ranch hand that day, Caleb. I want you to understand that. I was praying for somebody honest enough to stand beside me without ever trying to own me." "I think," Caleb said, "we were both praying for different things and got handed the same answer." She opened the Bible she still carried, the one that had been in her family longer than she'd been alive, and Caleb took her hand across the small space between them on the porch steps. They married that autumn, in front of the church Red Creek had rebuilt after the fire that had scarred the town years before Caleb ever arrived. Ruth Harlan, who had watched the two of them fall in love long before either would admit it, cried through the entire ceremony and denied it to anyone who mentioned it afterward. Eli Turner, the young ranch hand who'd worked alongside Caleb through the worst of the summer, stood as best man and spent the reception teasing Caleb about how long it had taken him to say something Eli claimed he'd noticed within the first 2 weeks. The wedding wasn't extravagant. Nobody in Red Creek expected it to be. What mattered was that it happened freely. Not because a bank demanded it, not because a ranch needed protecting, and not because anybody had forced either of them into a decision they hadn't already made in their own hearts. Walter Briggs, of all people, sent a wedding gift, a small clock for the mantel, with a note that read simply, "Glad to have been wrong about you, Mrs. Mercer." Nora kept the clock on the mantel for the rest of her life and told the story of it to anyone who asked, usually with a laugh, because forgiving a man his caution seemed a smaller thing to carry than holding on to resentment over it. That first night as husband and wife, back at the ranch house with the wedding guests gone and the lamps burned low, Caleb pulled Nora close in the doorway of the home that was now, fully and legally and in every way that mattered, both of theirs together. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, testing the name against her, low and unhurried. "Mr. Mercer," she answered, "you're going to have to get used to saying that a great deal, because I intend to make you say it for the rest of your life. I can think of worse chores." She laughed, and pulled him inside, and closed the door behind them both. By the following spring, the herd had recovered. The spring still ran clean and strong on the western edge of land that was, beyond any dispute now, entirely Nora's. And Caleb's, too, in every way that mattered. The debt was paid down. The fence Caleb had first repaired his second week on the ranch still held, patched but sturdy, the same as the two people who'd rebuilt their lives around it. Caleb Mercer had spent 13 years believing his worth began and ended with what he could do for other people. He learned, standing beside Nora Whitaker through fire, scandal, and grief neither of them had asked for, that the greatest thing anyone had ever given him wasn't a paycheck or a place to sleep. It was a reason to stop moving. Nora Whitaker had spent 14 months believing she had to carry the weight of an entire ranch alone, that asking for help was the same as admitting weakness. She learned that letting someone stand beside her didn't make her any less capable of standing on her own. It simply meant she no longer had to. And somewhere in a small Kansas town called Red Creek, a wandering cowboy who had once believed nobody would ever want him for longer than a season, finally stopped thinking of himself as a man passing through. He had arrived. And for the first time in his life, there was no other ranch waiting for him down the road. There is a version of this story where the moral is simple. That hard work pays off, or that love conquers every obstacle a summer can throw at two people willing to fight for it. Both of those things are true enough. But the truth Caleb and Nora carried with them longest was smaller, and harder to say out loud until they'd lived it. A person's worth was never meant to be measured only by what they could produce for somebody else. The greatest thing anyone can offer another human being isn't labor, or rescue, or even land and water and cattle enough to survive a drought. It's simply the choice to stay, freely given, asking nothing in return. Strength, Nora came to understand, was never about carrying every burden alone. It was about knowing which burdens were worth setting down, and trusting the right person to help carry the rest. And gossip, Caleb learned, will always travel faster than truth in a town small enough for everyone to know everyone else's business, which is exactly why it matters so much to wait for the facts before deciding what kind of person a stranger really is. The ranch is still there, past the burned church and the bend in the wagon road, past the cottonwoods that survived the fire that nearly took everything. The fence still holds. The spring still runs clear on the western edge of land that belongs, now and always, to the two people who chose each other freely, with nothing left to prove. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you and know just how far our story has traveled together.